We're going to talk a bit about congestive heart failure. I will say that this is a daunting topic, and I'm not covering all of congestive heart failure. There are many causes of it, and I've just sort of narrowed it down. And so if people have questions about other causes, that sort of thing, feel free to ask those at the end. The type of heart failure that I'm going to talk about tonight is low output heart failure. There's a kind that's high output heart failure that can come with thyroid disease and sepsis and other things. We're not going to cover that tonight, just low output heart failure. And in that group, there are two types, and then the third type is a combination of the two. And I'll try to make that clear to you. The first type of low output heart failure, that's when your heart isn't pumping enough blood to keep up with you. The first type is normal ejection fraction low output heart failure. What does that mean? Well, whenever your heart pumps blood, you have a chamber that squeezes. It's sort of like you have a plastic bag in your hands and it's got stuff in it, juice or water, and if you squeezed it, it would come out, right? Well, the ventricle's the same. It squeezes the blood. And you can imagine that when that happens, not all of the blood goes out with every squeeze. In fact, normally it's 55 to 65% of what's in the heart when you squeeze it comes out. And you say, well, that's not very efficient. Well, no, but it's efficient enough to have gotten you here tonight, right? So the heart pumps about 50 to 65% of the blood that's in the chamber at any one time. Every squeeze, about that much comes out. A little over half is normal. And the first type of heart failure, the percentage or the fraction of the blood that comes out is normal. And you say, well, wait a minute, if the amount that comes out is normal, how can you have low output heart failure? Very simply, the chamber only pumps the amount out that comes in. So if the ventricle is smaller than normal, if it doesn't relax and allow a large amount in, it'll only pump a small fraction out. For instance, if my wife's heart held a cup of blood and she pumped out a little more than half, we could say that'd be a half a cup. If my heart held 2 cups of blood and we got out half, that would be a lot more than hers, right? Same fraction, but hers wouldn't allow the same as much in, so it would get less out. So the first kind of heart failure is low output heart failure with normal ejection fraction. Normal fraction, but the heart isn't relaxing. And there are several causes of that. And if you look at that on an echocardiogram, the heart's contracting really nicely, but it's not relaxing enough, so it doesn't get a full load of blood. You can kind of think of it this way. If you were moving dirt or moving mulch, we're doing a lot of mulch moving this time of year with a pickup truck. If you could only fill it 1/4 full, you'd have to take a lot more loads than if you could get a full load. Same with normal ejection fraction, low volume, if you will, heart failure. The heart doesn't relax, it can't get a full load of blood, so the amount that it pumps with every squeeze is reduced. That's one kind of heart failure. That kind of heart failure is particularly common in people that have high blood pressure or are overweight. And we'll talk about why that is in a moment. The second type of heart failure that's low output is reduced ejection fraction heart failure. That's where the heart can fill completely, it fills up fine, but when it goes to squeeze, the squeeze is weak. Instead of having a nice vigorous squeeze, you just get a little squeeze. And that happens particularly in people that have had heart attacks. See, if you have a heart attack on the front wall of the heart, that part becomes like leather and doesn't squeeze anymore. The back part will still squeeze, but the front part won't. And you can see if half the pump's not squeezing, you'd have a low ejection fraction, low squeeze heart failure. Do you see the difference between the two? One, you get a full load, you can't empty it. The other, you get a half load, you can empty it fine, but you're only getting half the load. And you can have both kinds together. And the causes of those are important. So let's look at the causes. I've mentioned those there. Under 1, high blood pressure, obesity, and age. The older you get, the more stiff the ventricle gets, the less it relaxes, and as a result you have a tendency toward this type of heart failure. And then you can get it from atrial fibrillation as well. Why do you get it in atrial fibrillation? You lose the squeeze of the top part of the heart. In atrial fibrillation, the top pump, see the heart has 2 pumps really, actually 4, but has the top pump that squeezes blood into the bottom, and then the bottom that squeezes the blood out to the body. Leapt up, like that. But in atrial fibrillation, the top part doesn't pump, it just kind of wiggles. So you lose that atrial kick. So you don't fill the bottom as well, and as a result you have a low output heart failure with a normal ejection fraction. That's atrial fibrillation. With heart failure from reduced ejection fraction, you've lost that squeeze, and the risk factors for that are primarily previous heart attack or narrowed arteries to the heart. If you have narrowed arteries to the heart isn't getting enough fuel, if you will, enough oxygen, enough nutrition, and so it doesn't squeeze vigorously, it just squeezes a little bit. And you can get heart failure from that. Heart failure is not fun. It reduces your ability to do work. If any of you have had a truck that has cylinders and it's firing on 4 out of 8 cylinders, can you pull the same load? No, you do fine on the level, but when you come to a hill, you got trouble. Same is true with congestive heart failure. When it gets really severe, you do fine sitting down, but the minute you get up to walk, you start getting winded, the heart's not keeping up, and then you have problems. Some people say, well, why do your legs swell with congestive heart failure? Well, if the heart's not pumping well enough, fluid backs up. From the left side, it backs into the lungs, and so when you go to the doctor, if you have heart failure, the doctor will listen to your lungs, and he or she will hear what are called crackles. And it sounds just like if you pour milk on Rice Krispies. Crackle. And what you're hearing is water that's filling the air sacs, and when you take a deep breath, that air sac that is partially filled with water pops open, and so you get that snap, crackle, pop. We call those rails or crackles from fluid in the lungs because the heart's not pumping well and the fluid is backed up into the lungs. From there, it backs up into the right side of the heart, and from the right side of the heart, it backs up into you. That is your legs and your liver, and then you get fluid overloaded. And so if you have congestive heart failure, the doctor will say, I want you to weigh yourself daily, and if you gain 2 pounds or 3 pounds in a day or two, call me right away. We'll need to adjust your medicine, because that tells him that the heart is failing and he needs to adjust the medicine. And we'd like to avoid that. If you go out and you, on St. Patrick's Day, have a nice corned beef, serving a corned beef, you're going to swell because that has a lot of salt, and salt makes you retain water. Water then expands the blood volume, and you give this weak heart even more blood to pump, and it gets really tired, and so the fluid backs up into your legs or into your liver or wherever, any dependent region of your body. If you were laying in bed and you had your feet way up in the air and you had congestive heart failure, where would the fluid build up? In your back and in your chest. And that's why when you're in congestive heart failure and short of breath, you want to sit up, because when you lie down, you get really winded because the fluid backs up into your lungs unless you sit up. So there's the two types of heart failure, and then as I mentioned, the third is a combination, because you can have a ventricle that doesn't relax and it doesn't contract well. Well, you got real problems there, don't you? So that you can have both kinds. Before we go to treatment of congestive heart failure, though, just a word about kidneys. We can't consider the treatment of heart failure without taking into account the kidneys. And one of the things the doctor does when he sees a patient or she sees a patient with congestive heart failure, they always want to check your blood. Why? Well, they're checking your kidney function to see if their medications are adversely affecting the kidneys. Because if you got too much volume, too much fluid on board, how do you get rid of it? Kidneys. So they give you a water pill that makes your kidneys get rid of water. It makes you urinate more, but that's hard on the kidneys. So we're in this in between. We've got to help out the heart, but we don't want to hurt the kidneys. And so often people with advanced congestive heart failure have kidney problems too. So any diet that we give to you for heart failure, we want it to be really good for the kidneys. And there's one thing to keep in mind that's the best diet for kidneys that are having a problem. If you have kidney problems from a long time of high blood pressure, or you have kidney problems from diabetes, or whatever the cause is, the best diet for impaired kidney function is a diet that's very low in animal protein. The reason for that is animal protein puts a load on the kidneys that's extra hard to filter. And if you look at any of the nephrology literature, it will tell you, nephrology kidney literature, the medical literature on kidneys, it will tell you that if your kidneys are impaired, you want to limit animal protein. So because of that, you'll find that the diet tonight also will limit animal protein, because I want to keep an eye out for your kidneys if you have heart failure. Regardless, if you're working with your kidneys, whether it's milk, eggs, cheese, animal protein is hard on your kidneys. If your kidney function is completely normal, then there's no need to restrict animal protein for the kidneys. But once there starts to be an impairment because of the hyperfiltration, that's the extra work on the kidneys that comes with animal protein, you want to minimize that for kidney function. That's one of the problems with the very popular keto diets. They're very hard on the kidneys. In fact, if you go on an Atkins diet or a keto diet, you lose weight rather rapidly. But the first 10 pounds you lose is water loss from the hyperfiltration of the kidneys. And you come in and you weigh and you think, oh, I'm doing so well, I've lost 10 pounds and I've only been on this keto diet for a short while. But if we measure your fat, you haven't lost any, you've just lost water. And that doesn't do your kidneys any good. So that's one of the negative parts of that diet. So let's talk about dietary goals for congestive heart failure. And they're just 4 points here. The first one is to lose weight. And why is that? Well, very simply, you can do the math there. I wrote it out for you. For every pound of fat, there's a mile of blood vessels. Well, the heart has to pump blood through those, right? So if you are 10 pounds overweight, and if your heart beats 60 times a minute, and there are 1,440 minutes in the day, you've pumped blood 864,000 miles in 24 hours that you wouldn't have to if you lost that 10 pounds. Do you think that that puts a load on your heart? You bet it does. And that's one of the reasons why obesity is associated with heart failure. Because when you're overweight, the heart has to thicken its wall and strengthen its pumping ability to compensate for that extra mileage that you're pumping, and that's 10 pounds. Now, 864,000 miles is to the moon and back again every day, and you thought that heart wasn't efficient. It's amazing what your heart does, and it's amazing what a little bit of weight loss will do to unload the heart. Now, you think, well, but what about exercise? Doesn't that thicken the heart wall too? Yes, it does. It thickens the heart wall just like in obesity, except with exercise, you get not only a thicker wall muscle, you get a dilated heart. It gets bigger, it can hold a higher volume, so it gets stronger and larger, whereas in obesity, it gets stronger and smaller. And when it gets stronger and smaller, it's like trading in your 16-yard or 18-yard dump truck for a little Toyota pickup and having to carry the same amount of dirt around. Or pump, you know, you're trying to get a lot done with a tiny little squeeze instead of having a nice big squeeze from an athlete's heart. But if you're an athlete in college and you're really man on campus and you've done all this, or you're on a soccer team, and the women, I mention that because, as you know, United States soccer team, the women are doing great and men not so good. So if you're on, and then you say, well, I was a college athlete, but you get overweight, you've got that thick heart, but now it's shrinking and you're in double trouble. So one of the worst things you can do is be a has-been athlete. That's really hard on the heart. You want to keep that athletic ability as much as you can throughout life for your heart's sake. But just keep in mind, every pound of fat, there's a mile of blood vessels. It's astounding. It really is. And think of all the work your heart does and how you could do it a favor by just taking off a little bit of weight. So the first dietary goal, particularly for the kind of heart failure where you have a preserved ejection fraction, but the heart's little and doesn't relax well, weight loss. That really helps. And you know what? If you exercise and lose weight, that heart will remodel and you can reverse that kind of heart failure. That's the beautiful thing about the body. It really does want to help you. And so if you change your diet and you're losing that weight and you add in exercise, you can restore normal cardiac function. And I've seen this repeatedly on echocardiograms. People with diastolic dysfunction, that's where the heart should relax in the resting phase of the heart, should relax, it doesn't, but you put people on exercise and they start losing weight and you just see that heart relax and the strong pump stays there, and now they're really moving the blood. So if you have that, don't give up, there's hope. Restrict salt. Remember, if your heart is struggling, if it's having trouble getting the blood around and you increase the amount it has to pump, that's even harder on the heart. And when you restrict the salt, you reduce the volume that it has to pump, and it really helps. So you try to stay under 500 to 600 milligrams of sodium per meal, because this lowers the blood pressure and it lowers the volume that heart has to pump around. If you think about the heart, it has to pump against a head of pressure, right? And if your blood pressure is 110/70, that's like having to pump your blood up a hill this high. But if it's 180, you have to pump it up that much more. So it's a harder hill for it to pump the blood over, if you will. And so keeping the blood pressure down, just like losing weight, unloads the heart and makes the job much, much easier. So restricting salt, and on the back of your first page there, of your page, you'll see some notes on salt restriction, and we'll come to that again if you have questions. All right, number 3, I've spoken about this before for those of you who have been to these lectures. It's a different way of looking at a problem, and that's minimizing advanced glycation end products. That's a big word, isn't it? Advanced glycation end products, both endogenous and exogenous. The reason for this is these cause stiffening of the heart and of the blood vessels. Now, if you're stiff, you're going to have trouble relaxing, right? Same with the heart. If the heart is stiff, it has trouble relaxing. It also has trouble pumping. So anything that we can do to make the heart pump better, be more flexible, relax more, the heart's going to pump better. That's why we want to minimize these advanced glycated end products. But you notice there are endogenous, that means within us, formed within us, and there are ones that are formed outside of us, both kinds. So let's talk about both and what they are. These are very common in diabetics. Any diabetics here? Yeah, a couple. So when you go to the doctor, Cindy, what does he measure? Your hemoglobin A1C. Hemoglobin A1C is an advanced glycated end product. It is sugar attached to hemoglobin. Why do we measure it in diabetics? Because the more sugar you have in the body, the more sugar attaches to hemoglobin. And I can figure what Cindy's average blood sugar has been over the last 3 months. Before we had this test, diabetics would come in and they'd say, "Oh, my sugar's been really good." Well, what's it been? Oh, it's been running around 100 to 120, and they could be fooling us. But now they can't, because we have this hemoglobin A1C that tells us what it's been on average for the last 3 months. Why the last 3 months? Because red blood cells live for 3 months. The more sugar is in the body, the higher the percentage of the red blood cells that have sugar attached. But what happens when you attach sugar to hemoglobin? It stiffens it. Now, if you have stiff red cells, they're going to be hard to pump around because the red cells are 7 to 8 microns in diameter, and the capillaries are 3 to 4 microns in diameter, and you got to push this big thing through there, and if it's stiff, it doesn't flow well. If it's supple, it'll flow right through, no problem. But you know, that happens with more than red blood cells. It happens with every protein in our body. Have any of you noticed that when you get up in the morning, you don't jump right out of bed like you did when you were 10? You kind of, and after a while you start to limber up and you get, why is that? It's because of advanced glycated end products, age products age you. This process of aging is a process of stiffening, right? Anybody more supple than they were when they were 5? No, we're all stiffer, and this is one of the major reasons, and it's accelerated in the presence of diabetes or high blood sugar. The higher your sugar, the more you're going to stiffen, and it affects every organ system in the body, including the kidneys. It's one of the causes of kidney deterioration or kidney failure. It's one of the causes of congestive heart failure, stiffening of the ventricle. It's a cause of high blood pressure. It's also one of the reasons why when you're elderly and you fall, you break bones. Brittle bones are because the collagen is stiffer. Collagen is in bones and it's a protein, and when it's glycated, collagen doesn't stay around for 3 months, it stays around for years. And when it gets stiff and you fall, the bone's more breakable, more brittle, so this affects every organ system. How about vision? I have my own copy of this. You notice the print's bigger? That's because my lens has been stiffened because I didn't know this when I was younger, and I loved sugar, and that stiffens the protein in the lens, which is why as we age we can't read it here, we need it out here, and then we need cheaters because our arms get too short. That's glycation of the lens. So it affects all of our bodies, and it's related to two things. Endogenous is when we have sugar in our body that's above an optimal level. This happens more rapidly. The other happens in the way we cook food. You can cook food in such a way that you cause this reaction to take place in the food before you eat it. And he just took a list of, well, he took 500 different foods, cooked them in different ways, and figured out how many glycated end products were in these various foods depending on how they were cooked. The reason we didn't do this until 2010 is we didn't think you absorb this stuff into your body, but you do. And it's protein that has been glycated. Now you know from what I've said that if you glycate protein, you stiffen it, right? You twist it. So you're building your body with that protein that's already stiff. What kind of a body are you going to build? Stiff body, right. If you were building a house and the lumber truck showed up and all the lumber was twisted and brittle, what would you do? You'd send it back, right? I would recommend you do the same to glycated food when you eat it. Here's some examples so you'll get the picture. If you take a potato and you boil it, it has about 17 kilounits of age products per 100 grams. An apple has about 10, a banana has about 9. If you take that potato and instead of boiling it, you French fry it, it goes to 1,500. Yeah. So think about that when you eat French fries. What's happened? Higher temperature, and you've added oil in. And then it glycates more easily. You can glycate not only protein, but you can glycate fat as well. You can glycate DNA, and that's one of the causes of genetic problems as we age, is we glycate our DNA, and then when you go to cell replication or cell division, because the DNA is stiff, it doesn't match up right, and you get problems. You get mutations. You get higher risk of cancer. That's why diabetics have a higher risk of cancer, because of mutations in their DNA from too much sugar. So this affects everything. Here's a few other examples. You take chicken, you add lemon. Why lemon? Because plants have products in them that prevent glycation. So add a little lemon to the chicken and you boil it. It has a glycated index, it has 900 kilounits of glycated end products per 100 grams. Take that same chicken, you fry it, it goes to 9,000. Same chicken, barbecued, it goes to 18,000. So if you want to help your friend along down the pathway to early demise, he's got failure, barbecue up some chicken for him. Because that'll push that glycation and it'll stiffen everything. And you'll see why in the next section that will also be effective at, pushing him down the road. So the worst thing that you can do is you can take some nice bacon and fry it for 5 minutes, and that has a glycated end product of 91,544 kilounits per 100 grams. So if you have heart failure, have that bacon. It's got a lot of salt in it. It's got these glycated end products, and it'll help you right down the road to Brackett's or somewhere else in town. All right. So That's glycated end products. And the answer to these is you want to restrict refined sugar intake. If you're a diabetic, you want to control your blood sugar as close to normal as is practical. Why did I say as is practical? Because low blood sugars are hard on the heart. Low blood sugars are hard on the heart. And if you're running your sugar under 60, that can cause heart failure too. You have to fuel the pump. So if you're on insulin, don't run your sugar too tight. Better not to be a diabetic, of course, but as low as is practical, as close to normal as is practical if you're diabetic. If you're not a diabetic, just avoid sugar whenever possible. And 2, low temperature cooking, particularly if the food is high protein or high fat. And if you have more questions on that, let me know. This is true with plants as well as animals. If you take nuts, nuts are high protein and high fat, and if you roast them, they have about 7,000 kilounits of aged products per 100 grams. And those are good for you, right? Until you roast them. So you want to use your nuts raw whenever you can. All right, the last one is minimize trimethylamine oxide. Oh, what a long, awful name, right? Just call it TMAO, trimethylamine oxide. Now this is really an interesting, well, it is to me. Where's my wife? She doesn't like me to get into chemistry. Good, I don't think she's here. Oh dear, there she is back there. Sorry, Lynn. So this is a little chemistry, but we'll try to keep it simple. Choline, or L-carnitine, or lecithin, and you have the right bacteria in your gut, you form this product. If you don't have those, quote, right bacteria in your gut, you won't form it. So it takes the right food and the right gut bacteria, or the wrong, depending on how you're looking at it. These gut bacteria love animal protein. And if you're on a standard American diet, you've got lots of them in there. And when you eat a steak, they are so happy when they get the remnants of that steak down to the colon, and they just go to town and they make a whole lot of that TMA. And that TMA is absorbed into your body and it goes up to the liver and it's oxidized. There you get TMAO. And TMAO is a very interesting substance. It causes lots of problems. In fact, if I take a patient with congestive heart failure and I measure their TMA level, if it's really high, they have a 4 times greater risk of death within the next year than if it's really low. And that's regardless of how their heart is pumping at that time. They are also at higher risk of heart attack. They're at higher risk of stroke. In fact, they're at 4 times increased risk of death from all causes. So if they're on a standard American diet and they don't want to change, I can give them antibiotics, broad spectrum antibiotics, and I can kill all their gut microbiome. Just kill it out and they'll stop making TMA. And so that's one way we could treat it. But is there a problem with that? Yeah, there is, because those gut bacteria are really good for us. Or I could put them on a plant-based diet and tell them they could only have steak once every 3 months. Because if you take a vegan, they have completely different gut bacteria, and they don't make TMAO. They love fiber, and they don't really want anything to do with that animal protein byproduct. And so you take a vegetarian or a vegan that's been that way for a long time and you feed them a steak and their TMAO level doesn't bump at all. They don't have the bacteria to make it. So it takes someone who's on a standard American diet with all these bad bacteria, then they make TMA, it's changed to TMAO in the liver, and now they got problems. Interesting, isn't it? How our gut bacteria can help us or hurt us. And the pharmaceutical industry is just, they are so interested in this. because they want to make a drug so that you can eat anything you want and you won't make TMAO. You know, if they could just come up with some way to prevent that from happening and you just take this drug, but, you know, I say, well, that's one way. It probably wouldn't cost more than $5 or $10 a day of that drug, but you could just eat a plant-based diet. It makes a huge difference in your TMAO level when you do this. Again, that chicken and those eggs, if you look at the little paragraph there, to lower your TMAO levels, consider minimizing consumption of full-fat dairy. There it is. And you want to, including whole milk, also egg yolks, because they're very high in choline, and cream cheese and butter, and both processed and unprocessed red meat, beef, pork, lamb, veal, as well as fish, and nutritional supplements and energy drinks containing choline or lecithin or L-carnitine. Or you could just go on a vegan diet and then you could have that lecithin, which is found in plants, and you could have choline. Choline is an essential nutrient. We need it. And it's found in beans, and it's found in greens, and it's found in lots of things. But if you don't have the wrong bacteria, it doesn't harm you. So it's fascinating how the body works. And if you want to minimize congestive heart failure associated risk of death, those are the things you do. Lose weight, restrict salt, minimize advanced glycated end products, and minimize TMAO production. You could have egg white except for what? Kidney function. Because animal protein is a load on the kidneys requiring hyperfiltration and will accelerate kidney deterioration. And if you have congestive heart failure and don't have good kidneys, I'm in trouble when I want to give you a diuretic, furosemide or torsemide or metaxalone or ethacrynic acid, any of those, hydrochlorothiazide, chlorthalidone, all of those are hard on the kidney, and I need as good a kidney as possible, or we go for dialysis, which you know about. And so anything I can do to protect the kidney, I want to, because I have my eye down the road, you know, and if the kidney function is starting to slip now, I know I'm going to lose ground in 10 years or even in 5. So anything I can do to preserve kidney function, I want to. It's hard to get by without a good set of kidneys. Yes, it does. Chicken has a lot, will produce much of the TMAO, particularly, remember, if you fry it or barbecue it, because then you get advanced glycated end products. Now, if you have it once in a while, and you're mostly plant-based, you're not going to have the bacteria. What's once in a while? The studies that have been done say you need a 4-week absence of any animal protein in order to get the right bacteria. So once a month you can have chicken or turkey or beef, but you can't have all those once a month. And even, I would be careful with that for other reasons, but Cheryl.
I think there's still some confusion when they say animal protein.
Mm-hmm.
Not just meat, it's anything that's amalgamated.
Right. That's milk, eggs, cheese, fish, chicken, turkey, anything with 4 legs or 2 legs, anything that had a mother or a face. How about that? Question. Okay, so I didn't have anything to say tonight about cholesterol yet, or fat, and I mentioned that with the olives that we use olives instead of olive oil. There's a whole nother thing to treat congestive heart failure, and that is, what's the major cause? Heart attacks, narrowed arteries to the heart. Okay, now we have to deal with how do we clean up our arteries? And if you want to clean up your arteries, if your cholesterol's high, The way to lower it is don't eat cholesterol, right? That's number one. And then you want to avoid eating those things that make you make more cholesterol. That's number two. And what are those? Saturated fats, and that's butter and ghee, and sugar. Sugar makes your liver make more too, so we eliminate that one, or at least reduce it. And now we'll make less cholesterol, and then you got to do one more thing to lower your cholesterol. The only way to get cholesterol out of your body is to bind it to fiber and excrete it in the stool. So you want a high fiber, low fat diet. And if you already have narrowed arteries, you want to reduce or eliminate the oil. Why? Oil prevents your body from making nitric oxide in the quantities you need to dilate your arteries. If you have what does nitro do? Nitro dilates your arteries. You make your own nitro if your body's working well. It's called nitric oxide. Consumption of oil blocks that. Okay? That's a whole, yeah, that's olive oil. But nuts and canola, the same thing. It will block, it doesn't cause hypercholesterolemia, but it blocks flow-mediated dilation. Now let's talk just a minute. We're way off heart failure, but it's kind of fun. Let's talk for a minute about flow-mediated dilation. If I'm at rest, my heart doesn't have to pump much, right? It just circulates the blood. The minute I start to move, the blood flow to my right arm is now increasing. Why? Well, my heart's pumping a little harder if I do it long enough. My pulse goes up, and the arteries to these muscles dilate. And now more blood is flowing there. And if I leave this one still and keep pumping this one, the blood flow to my right arm will increase as much as 200, 300, 400% compared to this side. What if I had just had a nice salad and instead of olives, I had dumped a lot of olive oil on it? Well, what would happen, and they've done this in young, healthy college students, is flow-mediated dilation is blocked by one fatty meal, refined fat meal, significantly for 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours, which is why after eating is the most common time for heart attacks, because you put a strain on the heart, you can't dilate the arteries to the heart, and then you have a heart attack. Or you have chest pain. So you don't have to eliminate all oil unless you have heart problems or unless you want to maximize your athletic performance. Interestingly, they took the same college students and they had them exercise at 70% of their predicted maximum for an hour before they ate that fatty meal, and they didn't have any reduction in flow-mediated dilation. So you can eat anything you want, just about, as far as fat, if you exercise for an hour at 70% of your predicted maximum before you taste it. And if you do that 3 times a day, your diet gets to be a lot larger. Not many Americans do that. But when my son, who's an ultramarathoner, goes out and runs 50 miles, I don't tell him stay away from oil. I say eat what you want, right? You need that fat if you're running that hard. Great question. What temperature should you keep your baking below or your cooking below? And the lower the temperature, the better. Boiling is better than baking. But I don't want a boiled potato every day, so sometimes I bake them, but we bake them longer at lower temperature. And we're using our dehydrator more when we make granola. Instead of baking it in the oven, I now do it in the dehydrator. It lowers the temperature and you get just as nice a product. The least advanced glycated end products are in raw foods, but I don't recommend all raw because you absorb some of the nutrients better from cooked than you do from raw. I say do it about 50-50. I didn't mention fluid intake. First of all, generally, if you have advanced congestive heart failure or if you have congestive heart failure and kidney disease, sometimes you have to limit the amount of fluids you consume, period. Additionally, if you have kidney problems, you may have to limit the amount of potassium you take. And so some of these plant-based foods that I'm recommending are off the limit. I mean, you can't have them. If you have kidney disease, you got to be careful with potatoes, and you got to be careful with greens, and you've got to be careful with squash and avocados, and on the list goes. But I found that many people who are not on dialysis yet, if they'll go on a plant-based diet, eliminate the animal protein, their kidney function improves enough that they can start excreting potassium, and then they can have a more liberal diet. So even if you're already having to restrict potassium, don't give up if you're on a standard American diet. There's still hope. Now, to other things. Well, juices or sodas will push your glycated index up because they're sugar and you absorb it very rapidly. Not fruit, however, because you don't absorb the sugar very rapidly, except tropical fruit. The exception is bananas. Bananas have reverse starch when they're not ripe. Once they ripen, they'll push your sugar up. So I don't recommend you never eat bananas, but if you have diabetes or if you have a problem with your blood sugar, I'd say eat the bananas when they're a little green. I don't mean green in color, but you know, just after they lose that taste that's kind of drying to your mouth, but they're still firm. That's the best for diabetics.